Hey there. Why is it that President Obama and Democrats in general tend to do better with the economy than Republicans? And that's something that history bears out. There's been a lot of studies that show this to be the fact, even though Republicans would tend to deny it. If you look at history, we see like the Great Depression and the Great Recession both coming after Republican rule, presidential, Republican administrations. But some of the most prosperous periods in American history, especially since the industrial age, have been Democratic administrations. Now, I think that's pretty simple if you look at it. Republicans these days espouse the trickle down theory of economics, which basically posits that you need to give the rich people, the richest 1% of people, all the breaks. You have to lower their taxes and make it easy for them to do whatever they want. Basically, give them all the liberty. Don't burden them in any way so that they can. These are the makers. Mitt Romney would call them the makers versus the takers, which would be the other 99% of the people. And these makers, or I guess would be the sort of the blessed people who would create jobs as long as you don't bother them so much with your taxes and your regulations and such. And then if you allow them to create all these jobs, of course, the benefits would trickle down to the 99%. And that was the way that Ronald Reagan would explain it back in the day. And it continues, even though they don't use the term so much anymore, trickle-down economics. It's still the basic philosophy, economic philosophy of the Republican Party. Lower taxes, reduce regulations, give all the breaks to the makers, to the rich 1%, and then the benefits will trickle down eventually. But what we've seen is that generally doesn't happen. But first, let's go to the Democrats' economic philosophy. Now, the Democrats believe more in a grassroots type of strategy, growing the middle class and reducing poverty. And then if you do that, I like to think of it as a rising tide. The rising tide lifts all boats. And that's pretty much the idea of Democrats. If you have a strong, growing middle class, low percentage of poor people, the consumer base is stronger. And that, you have stronger communities. People have greater economic freedom and liberty. And then if that's the case, you're naturally going to have some people who are going to do well, going to be wealthy. The 1% will do well. They might not be as wealthy as with the Republican plan, where you have almost an aristocratic type of system going back to almost a medieval type of wealth, with very, very extreme wealth on one hand. And on the other hand, you have a lot of poverty, smaller middle class, a lot of people on the lower end of the middle class range, almost getting close to the poverty line. So that's the difference between the two parties. One is more grassroots, middle class oriented. That's the Democrats, and the other more oriented toward the wealthy, especially the extreme wealthy, the top 1%. The richest 1% of the people. But as we've seen, the Democrat plan, you can see it like in California. in Seattle, where we now have strong progressive governments. You know, in Seattle, the first city, big city, to have a $15 minimum wage, they have a booming economy. And in California, even though we were hit hard by the Bush Great Recession, we've come back also, despite the fact that we have more taxes, more regulations, more programs for the poor, for immigrants, for small businesses, not so much in terms of tax breaks for the rich. But the economy is doing very well. It's very resilient now. So you can see that the idea of the Democrats is a stronger one. Because, take for example, the poor. Poor people are a big drag on the economy. Poverty is correlated with, for example, high crime. You know, and that high crime results in high expenses to deal with the crime. You know, you also have problems with health. People don't have health care. They can't afford it. You eventually have to take care of them in the emergency room, and that gets extremely expensive, and it drives up the costs for everybody else. So you can look at examples, whether it's the Great Depression or the Great Recession, or nowadays you can look at states like California or cities like Seattle and see how the democratic system does better for everybody. Even though you don't get you still might get super billionaires, but maybe not as many of them or quite as filthy rich. But for the entire economy, the Democrats tend to perform better, and that's, again, you see that with the historical analysis.